Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and this broadcast number 511, September the 20th, 1981. I brought in about 30 or 40 of what I consider the top stories of the week, but I'm not going to run down a lot of names with you on the various items. I'm going to let a lot of it go till next week and cover with you 8 or 10 articles of what that I consider of primary importance and go into detail on those because they involve articles in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the wire services now, finally breaking open the story of those characters I've been sharing with you on KLRB for the past 2 years and their various international activities, their assassination teams, and the murderers. The men who are in the news now that are being studied by the Justice Department, Immigration, the Customs, the FBI, various agencies in the United States, in fact, all of them, and the Royal Mounted Police in Canada, Scotland Yard in Great Britain, the Swiss police are now into this. This is not an American problem. This is an international problem. And I have used on the air, as I say, for the past several years, the name of Edwin Wilson and Frank Terpil and George Corcola. Those names I began using at the end of 1979. And then new names I added to this team, this can of wolves, of Nazis, of international terrorists from the intelligence community and Navy intelligence. Men like Theodore Shackley, Nugan Hand, Frank Nugan, William Colby, William Casey, Vernon Walters, George Bush, and so forth. I have a list of names that I gave on broadcast 500, that was July the 5th, and I'm going to update to you some of the events in the news this week to bring in these names into this ball of wax. The system is finally getting unglued. I use that term every week. Before I get into what I consider the most important story of the week on this subject that excited me very much, the New York Times article by Jeff Girth and Philip Taubman on the CIA, the company, and an inquiry into bribery, but the article is much, much more than that. I do want to mention my concern for Maxine Cheshire. She is a phenomenal journalist. She's written a column for years called VIP in the Washington Post. She's been the most hard-hitting, consistent person, hitting deeper into the problems going on in the conspiratorial world than Jack Anderson does. Maxine Cheshire has a column that I referred to over and over on this program, and starting about 6 weeks ago, I missed her column. She was the one that suggested that George Corcola had been murdered recently. She's the one that broke the early stories of Frank Terpil and Edwin Wilson with Jimmy Carter and Robert Vesco and their links to the president of Panama, Torrijos, who was just murdered about 2 months ago. And she had many connections of the Nugan Hand Bank, just intimations or the hints of some very important events. And as I say, she was the only person who even suggested where George Corcola is at all since last December, since he was arrested in New York and left the country. And the last she wrote about him, she had information that he was murdered. Well, I missed her article, and I didn't want to be paranoid about this. Her syndicated column is not only in the Washington Post, but is covered in the LA Times and the San Francisco Chronicle. So I waited 1 week and one more week, and it was summer vacation, and I thought maybe she's taking a vacation. And I had this terrible fear for her that something happened, probably because of the amount of work she's doing. And I called the Washington Post this week and got a very curt answer. Maxine Cheshire is not here. And I asked if they have a forwarding address. No, she's no longer with the Washington Post. I called the directory and the information in Washington, D.C. She's not listed in any book, telephone book or directory. In 1978, she had a book written about herself and helped write information in it, and they described her as a woman who got inside of many scandals. She blew the whistle on the $2 million Nixon jewel scandal, on the Korea Gate scandal, incidences on the Ford family, Gerald Ford, Frank Sinatra, Henry Kissinger, Tongson Park, and Susie Park Thompson. And she was described as a woman who has guts and gets to the heart of the matter. Now, her getting into the Terpil story or the Congressman Jenrette and the Terpil family because Mrs. Terpil, I understand, was a secretary to the Buckleys. I think I mentioned this before, or maybe last week. William Buckley or James Buckley, I'm not sure, but there's a very heavy connection. I have to check out which one of those the Mrs. Terpil worked for. It's important to know because one is the Deputy Secretary of State. But Maxine Cheshire is not available, at least to write to or to call, and I certainly hope that no harm came to her and that she's well, that she doesn't come down with a Martha Mitchell cancer or that Jack Ruby cancer I always fear. I hope she wasn't fired from the Washington Post. I'm sure she was. There's a slim chance that she left at this time for vacation or whatever. But I just had a terrifying feeling a few weeks ago when I didn't see any column of hers of any kind and finally got the nerve to ask. And I hope that my first fears are not realized and that she's all right. But she was courageous. She is a courageous woman, and maybe she'll be syndicated somewhere else and we won't have anything to fear. But so far now, Maxine Cheshire is not in the news, and that is very sad. I miss her column, and I miss what she has to offer us. Now, this last week, there were many articles, one almost every day, on the subjects that I've been talking on this program, as I say, for the last several years. And I really appreciate the loyalty of the people who listen to this show every week, not sporadically, not once a month or once every 6 months or once a year. The people that take the tapes regularly, and some have listened for the full 10 years that I've been on the air, and subscribed to the tapes in the interim when I was doing them privately or for other stations. I appreciate their loyalty, and I think the payback that they're going to get now, those people that have followed this news analysis every single week, is a deep understanding of the things that I was saying, the understanding of past books that have been written, and an understanding of where the country's going to go in terms of exposés and investigations and the shuffling of characters based upon their knowledge of these names that many of you have become familiar with, and I just listed off a few of them. Now, this article in the New York Times, it was so important this week. The title of it was, "The Company of Ex-CIA Aide is the Focus of a U.S. Bribe Inquiry." And in essence, it has to do with Edwin Wilson having a particular company, an organization that he fronted, a CIA company called Control Data Corporation with headquarters in Minneapolis. And the allegations in the article were that he paid a particular person, he was to pay him $1,000 a month to spy on the army, our army in West Germany. Edwin Wilson was from the CIA and Navy intelligence, and he was paying somebody and bribing them to spy on another branch in the service. But the article goes way beyond the offering or bribery of one person to spy on another branch of the service. This article says that the investigation of these people that I have rattled off these names to you, a few of them, is long overdue. It should have been going on since 1977. And I have an article about how many people of the CIA were fired in 1977. That's 4 years ago, because of the Edwin Wilson, Theodore Shackley, George Kurkola, Frank Terpil scandal. 600, 700 people of the CIA were rearranged in offices, fired completely, transferred to other places because of these men. Now, that has been smoldering for 4 years, since 1977. This article in the New York Times says that the investigation has been plagued by delays, which I know because it is the most dynamite story that the United States government will ever have to face. It's been plagued, according to these authors, by a lack of coordination of witnesses, by a lack of cooperation of the investigating teams, by the protection of Edwin Wilson and his associates by members of Congress. Earlier this year, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms tried to get two men off the case that knew the most about it, and they fired them. And they don't know who was responsible for firing them and holding the case again. But now the important thing is that the two men are back on the case and they're actively involved. And according to the New York Times, this is what the article says. It's a front page article, then a full page behind it. The Wilson case has become one of the most important federal investigations in recent years. Now, you heard that first from Mae Brussell on KLRB, if you listen, and I warned you and told you this would become one of the most important. Now, the New York Times calls it one of the most in recent years. I think of the Korea Gate, the Senate Watergate, the Kennedy assassination, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the Senator Church Committee. Those were 4 important investigations. But this is bigger than those investigations. What they've got now in Washington, what the president has to deal with, and I'll go into that now. The article has a very nice little black caption, President Reagan is taking note. What President Reagan inherited and is part of and a front for is the international network of fascist organizations that I've talked about, the Grand Mason Group, Licio Gelli in Italy, the Permindex assassination teams coming out of Italy and Switzerland, Colonial Dignidad, and the torture centers of Nazis in South America with their links to the Nugan Hand Bank and this funding of Jonestown and mind control programs in intent for slavery and wiping out native populations around the world and killing labor leaders and writers and newspaper people. What they've got on their hands is a group that set up the SLA in California, the Baader-Meinhof in Germany, the Red Brigades in Italy, Carlos the Jackal, the terrorist, the Irish Republic Army, the Japanese Red Army. What they have on their hands is that the Navy intelligence and the CIA set up political assassinations in every country, had coups d'etats in every country that you can name that became fascist, that are getting ready for a bloodbath in Cuba, Guatemala, and Ecuador, El Salvador. Ecuador just had the loss of a president there. And what they've tapped into, and it's long overdue, the hints of it came in the Senator Church Committee, in the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Every one of those investigations, Representative Pike, the House of Representatives, the Rockefeller Committee, every single one of the investigations since John Kennedy was murdered has agents that were named in those investigations that link directly to the names that I have been giving you on the air for the past 2 years, to people like Theodore Shackley, Edwin Wilson, Frank Nugan, Michael Hand, Frank Terpil, Kevin McCullough, Richard Helms, George Corcola, George Bush, Vernon Walters, William Casey, William Colby, Alexander Haig, John Connolly, Michael Sindona, and the Vatican being taken over by the fascist group. I have mentioned different banking connections, but every major investigation has stopped short. And now, the New York Times, this last Sunday, a week ago today, yes, a week ago past, said this case is called the most complex, the most extraordinary case in complexity and significance and scope. And Jeff Girth is a person I mentioned who wrote the marvelous article on Richard Nixon and the Mafia and Resorts International, the Mary Carter Paint Company, the interlocking links in Bahama of Intertel, the group that took over the Howard Hughes empire. Jeff Girth is knowledgeable about that whole Miami southwestern faction, and it fits into the Miami-based World Fascist Organization with their interlocking links to Spain, to Italy, to Argentina, particularly France, the World Nazi Group, known to people who study the Nazis as the Odessa, the spider set up by Hitler at the end of World War II, getting ready for World War III, by 1943, when they knew they couldn't win the war against the Soviet Union. This team set up their organizations, and the New York Times is calling the Terpil Wilson case complex, ordinary, extraordinary case, complex, and so forth. They said they're working with the FBI. If you can imagine these agencies, everywhere they tap, coming into a new story and giving immunity to new witnesses. They're working with alcohol, tobacco, firearms. They're working with the customs, with international revenue, with every law enforcement agency they can, and I mentioned Canada, England, and Switzerland. Now, there's a wide range of offenses, and I'm just quoting one article in the New York Times last Sunday rather, the Violation of Neutrality Act, false customs declarations, failure to register as foreign agents, illegal exports, transportation of arms and ammunition, perjury, false declarations, bribery, fraud, and conspiracy to murder. Now, when they were importing and exporting these little ways of slapping their wrists are not just little taps on the wrist for minor infractions. This article mentions just one item, this Edwin Wilson, whose name I use so often, who's from Navy intelligence, with direct links to the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia and Colonial Dignitat in Chile. This Edwin Wilson, just for one item, had a business going for the Shah of Iran, where he was given a large amount of money, just $20 million, to do a particular operation for the Shah of Iran in the United States, $25 million. He had a home for $3.5 million next door to Senator John Warner, and there was an article in the New York Times asking a while back, how did he afford that home? Well, imagine the Internal Revenue trying to tax a man in absentia who's now over in Tripoli, who for one job got $25 million. Now, that only has to be international narcotics payoff at the highest level. It has nothing to do with architecture or construction. And every one of these teams has combined three forces that I've talked about week after week. International Nazi organization, the international narcotic market, starting with William Casey, the director of the CIA, hiring and working with Lucky Luciano in Italy when World War II was over, and making deals with Meyer Lansky and setting up the crime syndicate along with the CIA, with Reinhard Gehlen, the chief of Hitler's intelligence. When you melt those people together, and I have a quotation from a book to read you what happens in that case, that book, The Great Heroin Coup, what evolves has to be a matter of chaos, blackmail, and murder and exploitation of people, and the corruption of the court systems and the news media. So what is rupturing after an era from 1943 to 1981 is that because of various crimes and because various researchers pursued them, we came across clues, and I can link item after item, that we as individual researchers, maybe we were 11 when John Kennedy was killed, and I was one of those 11. Then there were 22, and then maybe 100, and maybe 200 or 300. But every one of those researchers, every name they have, fits into this grand plan that's coming open now, that's opening up. Every witness we have fits right into that plan. And I don't believe if the researchers, the handful, didn't pursue the assassination of John Kennedy, if the newspaper people didn't publish articles with material that we had, critical of investigations of the Warren Report, even as bad as the news media was, there's hundreds of books on the Kennedy assassination and on various conspiracies in the intelligence community. And as each author began to open up a little layer of their expertise of what they were going into, they tapped into this huge international fascista organization that was Hitler's organization, set up by Mr. Skorzeny, Oskar Skorzeny, and Martin Bormann, Joseph Mengele, Hallmar Schacht, and Hitler's whole team under the guidance of his chief of intelligence, Reinhard Gehlen, and Albert Speer, who passed away recently. That team is alive and well. They're well organized, but some of their illegal acts that have not yet fingered them as being a part of them, the acts themselves, are surfacing now, and the links to the Nazi organizations is all that is left to expose these kinds of people. The New York Times article, this one of the Jeff Gerth, the important one that I think is so significant because it touches so many bases, said that Barry Goldwater, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, said there is nothing new in the case. The committee has no plans to explore it. Now, Barry Goldwater is the mob chief from Arizona. He's the one who selected our new Chief Justice, and I warned about her and her possible mob connections, because she's so close to Goldwater. He has links to the CIA, to the military, to the Defense Department, and the drug dealers, and he is trying to quash the Senate Intelligence Committee from the Wilson Terpil Coca-Cola, but it won't wash because, believe me, with the amount of media coverage that's coming out now, it's going to begin to pour out. As I told you for weeks in the past, it has to come out like Watergate in terms of many books and many investigations. Now, the House Intelligence Committee, according to the New York Times article, this one says that they're following the case closely. They're following the performance of the prosecutor and other officials in the case. The grand jury is taking testimony by associates of Edwin Wilson, his relationship to politicians in Congress, and this is very important because of the links of Strom Thurmond to this assassination fascist group down in Miami that met with Strom Thurmond, and he was the man who wanted John Lennon deported, and a man in Congress that I triggered, being behind the John Lennon assassination as part of the intelligence CIA group. Strom Thurmond works with the Miami-based fascist group who have headquarters in Lebanon, where Mark David Chapman was, and Strom Thurmond is a big key to the Nazi fascist assassination team that got Mark David Chapman completely brainwashed and spun around the world until he ended up in front of the Dakota Hotel. And that was almost a year ago, if you can believe it or not. Now, Jeff Gerth wrote in this article that the one problem with this case is that they may run up against a little gray mail. Have you ever heard of what gray mail is? Gray mail is, it's the first cousin of blackmail. They said the defense lawyers for Edwin Wilson may use gray mail. That's the threat of introducing classified documents in open court to force the government to drop or settle charges on favorable terms. Wilson's charges involve dealings with Libya, our alleged enemy, but the investigation has uncovered many other links of Mr. Wilson to top military officials in Egypt, and again, they were trained by Otto Skorzeny and Hitler's team, as was Gaddafi. I mentioned that last week, and I have another reference of Skorzeny training Gaddafi, and how all of Edwin Wilson and Frank Terpil's relationships to Gaddafi have the approval of the CIA and of Navy intelligence and the highest levels of our government. And the more they go into this, they'll have to quash it or try on the basis of national security, because this is where we come to the push and shove of how Americans can provide the money and the arms for what they call the left terrorism, so that people like Alexander Haig and President Reagan can get up and give brazen speeches about terrorists, or this Sterling book on the terror network, or the Moss book on the spy, these propaganda books blaming the Soviet Union for terrorism, when the Tsarists, the Nazis, the CIA, the Defense Department are in it up to their ears. Now, this article, I'm just quoting all of this from one article in the New York Times. The investigation of these payments to Mr. Sear is just one sign that the FBI has widened beyond its original focus of Mr. Wilson. Now, originally they were going to charge Edwin Wilson with sending weapons over to Gaddafi. He's also charged for assassination attempt of a person in Colorado linked to Gaddafi, and I'll go into that article also because the charges with Gaddafi wanted this person killed in Colorado, and the man who was hired to do it, Tafoya, who's been charged with the attempted murder, he didn't die, came on CBS and National News this week and said, I worked for the CIA all along. It wasn't a Gaddafi case. I was in Canada. A man showed me his credentials. He worked for the CIA. He gave me the information to go to this apartment. We got in an altercation. I didn't mean to shoot him. He shot him through the brain, and there's a lot of damage to this particular student, a critic of Gaddafi's. But we were trying to blame Gaddafi for this attempted murder in the United States. And in fact, we sent home some Libyans from Washington, D.C., or moved their office around because of their terrorism. And the man charged with it says that the procurement officer who knew him in the Green Berets in Vietnam, knew him as part of the CIA, hired him for the CIA. He met Edwin Wilson in Switzerland, and he thought it was a CIA operation all along. This article said, did congressmen and other federal employees including of the official CIA, received money from Mr. Wilson. And then the article has a very cute passage about Ronald Reagan, and you better believe this one is true. It says, Reagan is interested in case. Now that is funny because, as I say, those of you that have listened to this program have heard me throw the names around of the complexity of this case, of that bank in Australia and other banks that fell, and their links to heroin and the CIA and the assassination teams. All of a sudden, Reagan interested in the case. Well, I know he's interested in this case because these are the people that put him in office, and these are the people he represents. But up to this point, there has been no question asked, a press conference of any kind. He avoids those very easily. But the Terpil, Corcola, Wilson case, Shackley, Klein's, is getting too close to home. The article says, in recent months, President Reagan and other top officials, including Assistant to the President for National Security Richard Allen, Attorney General William French Smith, Federal Bureau of Investigation Director William Webster, and the Director of Central Intelligence William Casey, have expressed interest in the case, according to intelligence and law enforcement. If William Casey was the attorney for Robert Vesco, and Vesco works with Terpil and Wilson and these people, you better believe they have an interest in the case. You see, Casey is caught too close to it to stay in the office. He should resign so that the CIA isn't tainted by his still being the director, but he can't resign because he has to cover the bases. He's so involved that they actually need him there to hold the finger in the dike. So that all of these people that are in power today with Ronald Reagan have a piece of this action. They are directly involved through their political contributions, their friends, their meetings, their associates, and therefore, as this comes down, it could be the Reagan gate for Ronald Reagan, because no matter where he goes, if he opens it up, it'll sink him and pull him in, just as Richard Nixon was sucked in Watergate. And if he puts a lid on it, it will keep pouring out and oozing, just like it did for Richard Nixon and Watergate for a year and a half. And as I say, the New York Times says, this is an extraordinary case. It is so complex in significance and scope. So when I tried to explain to you for many, many months and several years that I was handling something very complex and complicated, this one article in the New York Times this last Sunday, is September 13th, is the first explanation or attempt to explain the mass complexity of this particular story, how wide range it is, how every agency of the government has to get into it, how concerned all the federal investigators are, and if and when they keep tapping. And I don't see any way they can stop now, because there is so much coming out. And on the second half of this program, I'll just tell you briefly the articles that came out this week on this matter. Now, I don't mean Associated Press stories of 4 inches or 8 inches. A news story can be important, and I've picked up many important news stories that were 2 inches long on the back page, or where the classified ads are on the left or right-hand corner, unnoticed, or a little obituary. But when stories get full pages, and we haven't had that since Watergate, you know that the writers, and there are good writers on this case, are on top of it. I called 2 authors, I'll give you their names in a moment, from the Washington Post, and one of them I said, now you're leaving out George Corcola. Of course, I throw his name in every week on these programs. I said, when you put George Corcola into these stories that you are doing finally in the Washington Post, because you've ignored this for too long, then you will get a Pulitzer Prize, because that is the bottom line. Because when you pull him in, you pull in the Alpha 66, the New Jersey I.G. Farben connections, the Scotland Yard connections, Samuel Cummings, the monarchists, the Monte Carlo connections, the Nazi connections, the Miami fascist group. When you get George Corcola, that I keep saying on these programs, who's afraid of George Corcola, when those people get that story, like Woodward and Bernstein worked with Watergate, then they'll have the top story. And I needle them and call them because they have the means to put it together, and they may be avoiding taking that leap. And if they know you know it, maybe they'll look into it more. And I told this one writer I would send him information on George Corcola. We'll take a 1-minute break, and then I'll go back to some more newspaper articles this week on this subject.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
The Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant
I want to mention that for those of you who do take the tape cassettes of this broadcast by subscription or tape it off the air, and those of you that send for the printed sheets, the 2 pages, it's 1 page back to back, each week that have the bibliography and sources of information that I put on the air. If you take the compilation of those sheets and put them together, I punch them a 3-hole cutter and put them one set in a spiral notebook, not spiral, a 3-hole notebook in chronological order, the way I have them on the air. Then I also take them and put them in subject order, such as the Nazis, the intelligence community, various murders, and so forth, Jonestown, and separate them according to subjects. But if you put them in a chronological order and you look at the amount of material that has been covered on KLRB, and you realize that every single program that I have had taps in to these articles that are coming out now, or the investigations that may come out, you realize that this inquiry was long overdue, that the things that I have been saying should have been investigated separately, collectively, for a long, long time, and the powers that be have been sitting on this keg for so long, but Richard Nixon got out of office without their ever tapping any of these things, or even the first 30 primary witnesses of Watergate that were murdered. I wrote an article about that. And then Gerald Ford was in office and slid out, and Jimmy Carter covered this beautifully. He had his roommate, classmate, Turner, as the head of the CIA. They graduated from Annapolis together. But the CIA and Navy intelligence were behind these operations, so it was very cute the way Jimmy Carter, the 4 years he was president, had Navy graduate from Annapolis in the CIA. Now, there's a big conflict going on between Mr. Casey and Mr. Inman. Bobby Inman is from Annapolis also, Navy intelligence. And I think they're going to slide Casey out. As I say, he's holding the fort now because of so many team members being involved in these terrible scandals. Incidentally, Casey's pal, Max Ugel, that they got into so much trouble when Casey appointed him as a high official of the CIA, and then the appointment was taken away. He was pushed by Mr. Loeb from New Hampshire, and Mr. Loeb was the man who pushed Casey's position as director of the CIA for Ronald Reagan, because in New Hampshire, Casey swung that critical point for Ronald Reagan in New Hampshire. The McNell brothers are still missing. Dennis McNell was exhumed and declared died of natural causes, but I really doubt that. But the Ugel McNell brothers are floating around. Casey's under suspicion, and William Loeb died this week, just at a time when there's a lot of heat on these buddies. I think these particular deaths are always interesting to note, that it was William Loeb behind Casey and close with Max Ugel and the McNell brothers, and he just died this week. Now, speaking of long overdue, there was one article, September 17th this week, Associated Press story. In 1977, the CIA shakeup was linked to Libyan connections. Now, this is how important the Libyan connections were, but they were sitting on it all this time, and this is when Jimmy Carter was president. The shakeup of the CIA took place by Mr. Stansfield Turner, Admiral Stansfield Turner. He was the CIA director, Admiral Stansfield Turner, when Edwin Wilson was in the CIA and Navy intelligence. Okay, what they did was that they took 224 agents that were fired in 1977. They had 17 covert agents that originally were fired, linked to Wilson and Terpil and Corcola. Then 157 were asked to retire involuntarily from the CIA. 50 were transferred to other CIA divisions, such as Edwin Wilson was in the CIA, and then they opened an office in Washington and then called it Navy Intelligence Task Force 157. And 600 other jobs were eliminated at the time in the CIA. 600 other jobs because of the story of Wilson and Terpil. Now, for 700 people, it's actually more than that. It's 807 jobs to be displaced in Washington alone because of Frank Terpil and Edwin Wilson. You can believe that's important. And what they probably eliminated were many of the men who were part of the terrorist part of the SLA. That's why you haven't heard much of Carlos the Jackal in the last couple of years. Even though he was visiting these people, he hasn't done too much. The SLA team, the Baader-Meinhof, the Japanese Red Army, the terrorists, probably those branches had to be hushed up for a while. The shake-up was a small part, of an activity begun by Admiral Stansfield Turner, and it was sparked by the discovery of the relationship of the CIA of Edwin Wilson and Frank Terpil to Gaddafi over in Libya. So that was one of the articles this week. Many people, 807 people displaced, some transferred, some retired, and some of the jobs were eliminated completely. That was one of the important articles this week. Another article that came out just 2 weeks ago from a paper, The Oregonian, September the 6th, 1981. An entire page, and I don't mean a column or a half a column, a whole page. Head lead, it's on John Paisley. Spy suicide remains a mystery 3 years later. This has to do with John Paisley of the CIA, of Navy Intelligence, of the National Security Agency, who the attorney for his wife and widow is Bernard Fensterwald from the Committee to Investigate Assassinations, who was James McCord's attorney at time of Watergate. It goes into the relationship of John Paisley with George Bush in 1975, with the competition of Richard Pipes, who's now the head of the State Department, along with the other top officials, Alexander Haig and Richard Allen and the National Security Council. There was a conflict where Bush set up Pipes against Paisley. Paisley lost and was murdered. This article brings in the relationship of Paisley to James Angleton, who originally hired Reinhard Gehlen and Hitler's agents from the Eastern Division as soon as World War II was over. It goes into their links to the Nugan Hand Bank directly to Australia, and again the Nugan Hand operations in 1979-78. He had a direct telephone to Australia, and he was part of the CIA's Office of Strategic Research. This is a full-page article in a little-known newspaper, the Sunday Oregonian, and if you are interested in that and can't get that in your libraries, I don't know if it's available in libraries. If you send me money for copying it, it would be like 10 cents a page. It's a full page, maybe 50 cents, and postage and an envelope. For those of you who can't get it, I'll copy this for you because John Paisley worked with these people, directly with them, and this article is bringing up many points that link again to this notorious case. Another article that followed of September the 14th, important story, Beyond the Wilson Case, again by Philip Taubman of the New York Times. Ex-CIA agent raises broad issue involving agency and the transfer of arms. Now this again is a half a page of the New York Times, a whole half a page on the legality and the rationale of the CIA funding terrorists overseas, such as the organizations I told you that they're trying to say come from the left. And this article says the Wilson case reveals serious weaknesses in laws, regulations of policies, the transfer of arms, technology sent abroad, and how is Ronald Reagan and the administration going to stop United States criminals, this article asks, and how will we prohibit training of terrorists abroad by American citizens when Americans from the Defense Department, the CIA, the National Security Agency can have sale in weapons overseas, to sell explosives overseas, and send all the mechanisms for intelligence operations and skills. We train them here, then they go over to other countries and spread terrorism, and this goes into the various laws and the problems with Mr. Klein's, Thomas G. Klein's, Theodore Shackley, and Mr. Wilson, and it mentions those people. Thomas Klein's is very important. Another article the New York Times has been covering, the Washington Post, September the 10th, got into the story, The relationship with the CIA aide gives credibility to arms seller. Another full page. As I say, I want to emphasize this again. These aren't one-inch columns. These are the links to the Miami assassination teams, to a Mr. Quintero, who now lives in Dallas, Texas, who works with Mr. Klein's, who associates and has this common lawyer and offices with Wilson. It goes into the assassination teams of Patri Loomis, the Green Berets, Theodore Shackley, their work in Laos, Indonesia, and the Nugan Hand Bank. The Washington Post finally began heavy articles, 2 long articles on this subject. The authors are Patrick Tyler and Al Kamen. It was Patrick Tyler I phoned this week, and as I said, you wrote 2 beautiful articles, but you left out George Corcola. Let's get with it, and you'll, as I say, have the Pulitzer Prize. It's yours. Go for it. And he said, send me your tapes or send sheets, and I will. The next September the 12th, this is all pouring out now, and I mean pouring out. Here's another large article from the Washington Post, a full half page. The Justice Department is sent bribery allegations. This is similar to the New York Times article, and it goes into the competition of Edwin Wilson with Admiral Bobby Ray Inman in the intelligence when he was the head of Navy intelligence and Wilson was in Navy intelligence, and the conflicts with William Casey. And this goes into the interplay and interpolitics of what must be going on in Washington, D.C. as these stories get unglued. Jack Anderson has an article this week, Spying on Each Other. It has to do with Edwin Wilson and Frank Terpil, and it's also important because it tells how the CIA gangs up with the national security and Navy intelligence and how they compete and spy and betrays the other agencies, that they spy on each other, that we have the CIA that would centralize after World War II major intelligence gathering areas, but that they spy on each other. And one of the articles I mentioned tells about Edwin Wilson bribing, he's from Navy intelligence and CIA, bribing another party to set up wiretaps and bug the Army. The agencies are so busy bugging each other that they hardly know what's going on in other countries. The story of Mr. Tafoya finally broke the national news. Last week I said on KLRB that I didn't believe that Gaddafi had to have anti-Castro Cubans, American CIA, killing people that he didn't like in Egypt or the United States. It didn't make sense. And I emphasize this, that if the CIA wants to kill them, they'll kill them. If they don't want to, they won't. But why does Gaddafi have to come to us to get people to assassinate people he doesn't like? He's mean enough and bad enough, and he's got enough weapons. Goodness knows we sent him 200 million rounds of ammunition and weapons to do it. And where are those exploding typewriters and cigarettes and ashtrays and lamps and rocks? We're supposed to send all that to him, so why isn't he using it? And one of the people he was supposed to have ordered murdered was this fellow in Colorado who was, as I say, seriously wounded in the head. Well, this week after I challenged the allegations that Gaddafi could order all of these things, Richard Tafoya, he's from the Green Berets, said that he shot Zagali in Colorado in self-defense. This is a student critical of Gaddafi. He shot Mr. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, Zagali, in self-defense, but he says that he is part of the CIA, that he got a message from the CIA, that he was interviewed by the CIA, and he claims that the CIA is behind the attempts for placing him where he was and for the actions that he did. He told this to CBS, and it had nothing at all to do with Gaddafi. It had to do, again, with Edwin Wilson and the United States assassination teams. Another article from the New York Times, The Odd Couple Running the CIA, and it has to do with William Casey and Bobby Inman of Navy Intelligence. Now, Casey talks Brooklynese because he's right out of the mob, and Inman is the cultured Navy Intelligence, and the two of them need each other because the mob and Navy Intelligence, from the days that William Casey hired Lucky Luciano and worked with Navy Intelligence, have covered this globe with drug traffic, heroin traffic, assassination teams. So it's suiting, it's very good, William Casey and Inman, the odd couple at the CIA working together. They'll fight each other, but they've got to cover each other's tracks. And while they're the odd couple, I guess they'll be there for a while. Another article in the Washington Post, an editorial this week, the old spooks who don't fade away. And this is in the black arts of covert action, working in the atmosphere of conspiracy, illegality, and so forth. A lot of people question, if you talk about a conspiracy, they laugh. This Washington Post article says, what do you do with old soldiers who are spooks and spies for the CIA who practice the black art of covert action, of conspiracy, of illegal acts, even the black arts, the assassination? What do you do with them? And it refers to Edwin Wilson and his anti-Castro Cubans and the work that they're doing and their CIA connections. And the article says, aside from media chants, the reason the Wilson Fair is again at center stage, and they now say the Edwin Wilson Fair is at center stage, is that in the interim, a new administration of Ronald Reagan's has come to power that pledged to combat international terrorism, especially Gaddafi. Now, it's sobering news that through the likes of Mr. Wilson and his Confederates and some old anti-Castro Cubans of the CIA, that the United States itself has had a hand in creating the very menace that it's combating. And how many times have I called old Reichstag Haig and Heinrich Reagan, fighting terrorism, when how many times can they say that before the truth comes? Well, the answer came in an editorial, finally, besides Mae Brussell on KLRB, saying, now that the Wilson Fair is in center stage, and back there it must be, when Washington Post and New York Times and even the Oregonian are carrying full-page stories, every word on the page, and editorials, plus smaller articles, when it comes full circle, what do you do when you find out that you created the menace you're supposed to be combating? And this editorial says that Mr. Wilson was up to his Libyan tricks, but some inner sanctum is still running him. And what are we going to do about him? No matter how the old CIA hands and the retirees and the ex-contract employees alike make a good adjustment when they leave their covert action, what do they do in the case of the Wilson affair, the assassination of Orlando Letelier? What do you do with Howard Hunt and Watergate? And this is an ugly problem. This is the editorial from the Washington Post about the alumni of the CIA. What do you do with the old spooks that were doing the killing that go out then and spread the job elsewhere and continue? Another, and finally, one more article, September 17th, and this is quite a lot of articles this week, just as I say on this subject, 1977 shakeup. This is another one about the Libyan connections and the changing the CIA ranking order because of Wilson and Terpil. And finally, one of my subscribers listens loyally and puts his tape on other stations, reminded me of the book The Great Heroin Coup. Some of you have it and some of you don't. It came out in 1980, this last year, by Heinrich Kruger, South End Press, Box 68, Astor Station, Boston, Massachusetts. Maybe this is too fast. If you don't have a pencil, you can phone or write to me and I can tell you how to get it. I think that research must carry The Great Heroin Coup, too. And in the back of The Great Heroin Coup, in the last chapter, it talks about the Miami conspiracy in chapter 23. And it goes into the fascist front organizations that are in Miami, where the headquarters of the International Fascista in the United States come and go with great expertise. And it talks about a group of the fascist organization, Paladin, that's the name of Skorzeny's group. They talk about Otto Skorzeny, Kruger does in his book. SS Colonel Skorzeny was a kingpin of the Paladin mercenary group until his death in 1975. Dr. Gerhard Hartmut von Schubert, formerly Joseph Goebbels' propaganda minister, was its operating manager. The headquarters were in Spain. Skorzeny had an export-import office there in Madrid, and it goes into his office, and they worked in the same office with the United States Central Intelligence Agency. Paladin's bankroll includes Skorzeny's weapons empire and Libyan head of state, Muammar Gaddafi. The Skorzeny-controlled World Armco, with main offices in Paris, was registered in the name of their manager, von Schubert. And it goes into their links with the International Fascista in Argentina. International Fascista was a crucial first step to fulfill the dream not only of Skorzeny, but his close friend in Madrid, Joseph Lopez Rega. Now, Rega is the man directly linked, the blood brother to Licio Gelli, who just fled Italy, who's down in Argentina. And it goes in, the great Heroin Coup goes into the Italian fascist money that after World War II set up the future CIA counterintelligence with whiz James Angleton, and they and other Nazi and fascist powers throughout the world, Europe, Latin America, envisioned a new world order built on the fascist Iron Circle, linking Buenos Aires, Santiago, Lima, La Paz, Brazil, and Montevideo. Now, one of the people that was involved with this operation, the Great Heroin Coup goes into, was Theodore Shackley. That's the fellow that I've mentioned on the air here many times. This is the last chapter of the book, The Great Heroin Coup. Their station, the CIA station called J.M. Wave, was in Miami. They were responsible for killing Ben Barka in Paris. J.M. Wave's chief was Theodore Shackley, Morocco station chief Robert Wells, and the head of the CIA chief station in Frankfurt. And that's where Mohammed Ajag, the man who shot the Pope, was linked to the National Fascist Nazi group in Frankfurt, Germany, and was in Spain 3 weeks before he went to Rome to shoot the Pope. The CIA contract agent, Fernando Legros, associated with Ben Barka and became a spy. When J.M. Wave and this assassination group had killed Barka in Paris, and he was to work with Castro, they were setting up a third world meeting. When Barka was murdered at the time, he was going to meet with Fidel Castro. When this was dismantled, Theodore Shackley and his staff left Miami for Laos, left behind a trained army of 6,000 fanatic anti-communist Cubans that set up elements of the U.S. far right. In Miami's Little Havana, they set up the Alpha 66 and the Omega 77. Now, those were the groups actually formed in New Jersey by George Corcola, and they had their more notorious leaders were all trained by the Central Intelligence Agency. Between 1965 and 1971, they had sporadic acts of sabotage and assassinations, and they were also being paid by Santo Traficante and the syndicate to help spin intricate U.S. narcotic webs. They found time to work for Richard Nixon and his White House staff. They were international drug traffickers. The Great Heroin Coup links this group to the 1976 murder of Orlando Letelier and Sandra Moffat, to the DINA, which is the secret police in Chile, the Nazi secret police, and Kourou, their organization in Miami. 4 of the 5 Cubans involved in killing Letelier and Moffat were CIA veterans of the Bay of Pigs invasion. The attempt and Letelier murder, the Leighton attempt to murder, that's Bernardo Leighton, a member of the Christian Democratic Party in Italy that was they planned to murder but didn't get that one off. But they killed Letelier, were coordinated by American-Chilean agent Michael Townley. Now, Townley worked for Theodore Shackley. He worked for Edwin Wilson. And what I'm trying to say in this particular program this evening is that finally the major media, and I consider the Washington Post and the New York Times and the wire services picking up, are acknowledging that the United States has a complex problem, that the FBI, the Treasury, the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, the customs, that there is attempted murder, and if they want to go into it, there is plenty of murder that these people have done. This team goes back to the Bay of Pigs. It was involved in killing John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. John Paisley worked with Lee Harvey Oswald Navy Intelligence in the Soviet division, and I'm sure that Yuri Nosenko was the agent in the KGB, the double agent of Reinhard Gehlen, who fled to this country as soon as Oswald had been the scapegoat or patsy. Nosenko came here immediately after Kennedy was killed and worked with John Paisley. Now, many books have been written about the narcotics traffic in the world. Many books have been written about the Nazis and the network that was formed at the end of World War II. There are many books on the Bay of Pigs, on the particular individual assassinations. There are inquiries into missing money, millions of dollars, $10 million from a safe deposit in Nice, $5 million another week later, $200 to $300 million at the Wells Fargo Bank, $55 million, the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia, $60 million out of the Philippines. We have talked about missing millions. I've talked about people being murdered. I've talked about the places of torture and Nazi headquarters down in Chile, the Colonial Dignidad. I've done many programs on the Pope who worked at Auschwitz, this particular John Paul II, the teams that killed Nelson Rockefeller, and I'm very confident that they can't gray list or gray mail and hush all of this up. There are too many books out. There are too many people writing articles for it. It may not all come to the apex of the Nazi fascist links, but it may not take too long now. It's been 17 years since John Kennedy was killed. In this book, The Great Heroin Coup, he has many references and other books that have been written on the subject that people can look up. So there's more people knowledgeable on this subject than Mae Brussell. I don't think there's many people that have the nerve to get on the air week after week and say these things, but they are putting it together. This book, The Great Heroin Coup, goes into the Operation Condor, the assassination teams, the links of them to Miami from Argentina. And there's quotations of books that I have had on the air, such as Cookrich's book, Galen, Spy of the Century, and other books. They have many references and bibliography throughout this book he has in The Great Heroin Coup. Even he has A Search for the Manchurian Candidate by J.D. Marks on mind control, Carl Oglesby book, The Yankee and the Cowboy War. And he has a quotation from that book of what happens when the United States government puts together its agencies and agents with an international fascist group and with organized crime. There's a quotation in Oglesby's book that I'll finish with, and the U.S. historian Carl Oglesby, this is Kruger saying, sees the origin of the CIA's sinister record in its alliance that it forged immediately upon its birth with Reinhard Gehlen and Vaslov from Russia that organized what they called Operation Underworld. That was the link of Meyer Lansky, the crime syndicate with Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence. How can a naive, trusting, democratic republic give its secrets to crime and to the Central European fascists and expect not to see its continent polluted? Now that is the central crux of the problem that I've been talking about for 10 years. I'm on the 11th year now, and Carl Oglesby words it that way. How can a democratic republic actually survive when the Constitution is polluted by European fascist crime syndicate and they try to manipulate the world? That is the question. How can it survive? And the answer is it can't. What you get is a duplication of Nazi Germany, or you change it now, because you can't keep intending to change it as they get more and more money and more control. The problem has been here a long time. It's getting more carefully defined in the media. I'm glad about that, and look up some of these articles from this week. These are all just in 1 week's time, and you'll find a lot to ponder about and relate to past information. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. You take care, and I'll be back with you next week.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.